Welcome to the Ripcord Moment. I'm your host, Joe C2. Today we're joined by Chris King. He's a good friend of mine. He's also an author, a public speaker, and a coach. His book, Renegotiate Your Existence, really encapsulates the kind of work that Chris does with his clients, where he facilitates journeys to allow those companies to discover what are sustainable action plans and advancements for them to really achieve their moonshots, their big, hairy, audacious goals. Chris has a particular expertise in working with women groups and women entrepreneurs, ensuring that they're optimizing not only their business, but also their personal lives as well. He's trained really with the best in flow research, including the Flow Genome Project, Dr. Andrew Huberman, and also Mark Devine with the Unbeatable Mind. He also regularly trains in mental and physical endurance activities with retired U.S. Navy SEALs. Chris, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Joe. So good to be here. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So you really have developed an expertise around this concept of flow that you bring to your clients to help them catapult what's possible in their business. So talk to us a little bit about what flow really is.
Yeah, flow, and I am a flow junkie, so I absolutely love this stuff. Flow is a simple name for what athletes call being in the zone, or you've heard the term runner's high. It's all the same thing. And essentially what it is a state of consciousness where you feel your best, you perform your best, you're never stressed out, and you're using fewer resources to make this happen. So when you get into the zone, when you can get into a flow cycle, you are getting exponential increases in creativity and speed and eliminating your stress.
So it sounds like you're getting them away from the analysis paralysis, the daily grind, to really perform at a much higher level. How do you get someone to access that state just at will?
Yeah, it's kind of different for everybody in terms, like what gets you into flow isn't necessarily what gets me into flow in terms of like the activities. What will work for everybody is what we call flow triggers. There are 22 of them that we know of. And so the opportunity is to set the conditions and the circumstances in your organization, across your team, in your own personal life with these triggers so that you can produce these flow states. And that's flow becomes the natural end result of setting up the triggers.
So in some ways, it sounds like you're teaching them by finding these triggers, whichever they're individualized, I'm assuming per person. Maybe they have 2 or 3 or whatever the number is, that tends to work with those individuals to recognize them, to capitalize on them so that they can get into that state.
Close. The triggers are consistent, but the way that we relate to them are different. For example, risk. Risk is a flow trigger. Okay. You need a little bit of risk involved in the activity you're doing because flow requires a certain neurochemical cocktail. And if there isn't enough risk present, then you're not going to have, there's a chemical in the brain called norepinephrine. Sometimes it's called noradrenaline, but you need that in order to get into a flow state. So risk has to be present. So what's risky for you is not risky for me. And what's risky for me is not risky for you, but you need the right amount of risk in order to produce a flow state. You know, some of the other flow triggers are going to be novelty. You need things to be different. You need complete concentration. You got to be really focused on what you're doing. So the more of these flow triggers you have in your world, the more flow you can get.
And how do you, I guess, so for controlling an environment, I would imagine it's relatively easy if you're an individual to some degree, right? Because theoretically, you can set your environment up to manage those conditions as optimally as possible for those triggers to manage those triggers accordingly. When you're dealing with multiple individuals or a group, how do you work through managing the environment to allow these triggers to, I guess, work to their benefit?
It's a great question because there are sort of 3 levels of flow. There's personal flow, like individual flow. There is team flow. And then there's like communitas, like when you go to like a rave party or a rock concert or something, and everybody's just, right? It's the whole place.
All raise the roof.
Right. That's all that's going on. Right. So, the trigger is going to be mostly the same, but when, like I mentioned, risk as a flow trigger. Well, now what we need is shared risk. We all got to be in the same boat together. Right. We got to have shared goals, right? We got to know what those are. So, so it's not hard. Okay. This is not complicated. Is the better way to say it. It's not complicated. It's just not easy because so much of what we need to do in order to access a flow state is counterintuitive. The behaviors are counterintuitive. So the tricky part about flow, frankly, is the behavior modification.
So what are some of those behaviors? Because what it sounds like, what I'm hearing, if I'm reading between the lines, is, or what I'm hearing you correctly say, is you're really trying to create alignment in teams so that they're all moving cohesively in one direction. And flow allows, in some ways, to help to have the, I don't know, sort of that oil, right, to the lubricant to allow the machine to move more seamlessly and smoothly.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I mean, and we see this in professional athletes. We see it in teams, in particularly teams that are innovating.
Okay.
Like my favorite story is about the Skunk Works, Lockheed Corporation, and how that came to be. The short version of the story is that the War Department needed to build America's first jet fighter in 1943 for World War II. Lockheed had no idea how to do it. Like, we just keep blowing things up. We don't know how it works. And the War Department said,
eventually we'll figure it out.
Right. You said you got 180 days, figure it out. They said, we don't have any money. We don't have any place to build it. War Department said, we don't care. Figure it out.
Figure it out.
So they set up what later became known as the Skunk Works. They delivered the first jet fighter, the XP-80 Star Shooting Star. They delivered that something like 37 days ahead of schedule because they created a team that was oriented around flow.
Okay. Got it. So in some ways, it sounds like, well, the innovation is a critical aspect to this. So do you find, I mean, let me ask you this then, on the flip side, right? And we're applying this to business owners, right? Who maybe are wanting to create more enterprise value in their company.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, maybe their growth has flatlined. Maybe their culture is such where they, it's like, hey, we're profitable, right? Our clients are happy, status quo. They're not necessarily innovative. They've gotten sort of comfortable or complacent. How do you interject, or how do you bring what your skills are to help maybe reinvigorate that level of innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing is to slap them, right? Wake up.
Wake up.
Because if you're not innovating, you're dying.
True.
I mean, let's look at this through the world of exit strategy and planning. Okay.
Yeah.
Normally you're going to want to plan 3 to 5 years out, right, for your exit, right? So that's kind of the roadmap.
Sure.
Now, there's something called the law of accelerating returns. Do you remember Moore's law, where the processor speed doubles every 18 months?
Yep.
Okay, think of Moore's law on steroids, right?
Okay.
The law of accelerating returns shows that the year 1920 is to 2020 as 2020 is to 2030. You're going to see 100 years of technological advancement and evolution in the next decade.
Right.
Now, if you play that out even farther, you're going to see 20,000 years of evolution in the next century. To put that into perspective, Joe, that's going from the birth of agriculture to the birth of the internet twice.
Wow.
So as you're planning your exit strategy in 3 to 5 years, that world does not exist. How can you guarantee that you're going to be relevant 3 to 5 years from now when, the 1920 to 2020 thing? I mean, that's like saying, okay, we want to exit in 1923, but you're really planning for 1947, right?
I love that perspective. That's a much different, right? So what you're saying is, because the rate at which the world is changing and innovations happening around us, by definition, our businesses need to stay at pace and innovate, or otherwise we're obsolete.
Right. You could be obsolete in 18 months while you're planning for your 3-year, 5-year exit.
Right.
So you have got to put a very high focus on innovation and your ability to pivot. I love the line that Gene Kranz said. Gene Kranz was the flight director at NASA during the Apollo and the Gemini space missions. And there's a line that they highlight in the old movie Apollo 13, where Gene says, I don't care what anything was designed to do. I care about what it can do.
Right.
And keeping that on your radar. I understand this is why it was built, but even when I worked in tech, the reason that people bought our products and the way that they use them were very different.
So I want to pivot back to something, because what you're bringing up in terms of innovation requires change. And you talked about fear a minute ago. And change oftentimes is, they think people are humans, right? I think by definition, a lot of people don't want to change, right? There's fear around it.
Yeah,
So
we're inherently resistant to it.
yeah, exactly. I think it's maybe in some ways hardwired into us.
It is.
How do you necessarily make that your friend?
I will quote my friends down at Unbeatable Minds, Seal Fit. Embrace the suck. Right?
I've heard that before as well.
Because look, struggle and progress are in relationship. You don't get progress without struggle.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Right? If you want bigger success, get bigger problems. I was working with a guy. Actually, he's really funny. He would come in with the weight of his world on his shoulders. He's a business owner. He's actually in the restaurant business, going through the pandemic, and we were able to maintain him at flat revenues while everybody else was being decimated because we were able to innovate and innovate and innovate. And he would come in, and I told him this early when we first met, a few years back. I said, if you want bigger success, get bigger problems. And so he would come in with the weight of his world on his shoulders, and he would unload. And then I'd look at him and smile, and I would say, look at you with your cute little 6-figure problems. And then he would just start laughing, right? Because it sort of lightened the mood. And then you fast forward about 18 months, and the same thing would happen. He would come in with all the weight of the world on his shoulders, and I'd smile, and I'd look at him and go, look at you with your cute little 7-figure problems, Right. It's like it puts it into perspective, right? Sure. So you don't have to like what is going on. This is the important part. You don't have to like what is happening in order to make it work for you. If you can get out of how much you don't like it and get out of how much it sucks, because this has an effect on your neurochemistry and your psychology, you go, okay, it sucks, I don't like it, and how can I make this work for me?
For me, sure.
Right? Because it changes your neurochemistry and it physiologically changes the way your brain works. And this is how you come up with creative solutions.
I love that. In terms of, so it's, again, I want to go back to taking this from the individual level, though, to the team level or the group level. Are there any, I guess, pearls of wisdom you can share for the leaders who may be struggling with, like, they understand it's tough, they've embraced it, how to get the rest of the team to embrace the
personality, the energy, the attitudes, the philosophies of any entity, any group, any team, any organization will be that of the person who sits on top of that organization. So it really starts with that accountable place, that leadership. Nobody is ever freaked out on a naval vessel because the captain always knows what to do. And when the captain doesn't know what to do, the captain always knows what to do. Like, that's the idea, right? So nobody freaks out, right?
Yeah.
So it is a mindset thing.
So it's really going to come from the top down, is what you're saying. And everyone looks to that leader to see how they're behaving and tries to model after that.
If you want to look, I like to look at the masters, right? Anytime I want to learn something, who's really good at that? If you want to look at how do I protect my brand, look at Disney. Nobody protects their brand better than Disney, whether you like the organization or not.
Right.
Now, if you want to look through the lens of leverage, right? Because that's what we're talking about. How do we make this work for us? How do we leverage this? Look no further than the United States government. Regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, no matter what happens in the world, how do we make it work for us? How do we make that drive our agenda and achieve our goals? Whatever those are.
Okay. What else? What's the most? Give us maybe some more specific examples around how you've been able to move the needle for clients. How more in-depth discussion around the flow and how you've really just seen it sort of transform organizations. Again, specifically businesses that are likely to exit in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I think I'm looking to my favorites because I was working with a B2C company, and they were on a really steep growth curve. They were doubling. They were at 10 million revenues, and they were doubling to 20, and they were having massive growth, which at that pace creates a lot of frictions. They would literally say there are people walking down the halls that were not here yesterday. I have no idea who that is, right? So there was this massive growth curve, and it became a question of culture. Right. So how do we maintain our company culture, and how do we get this, rolling smooth? I said, okay, first of all, you don't. Right. That's the first problem that you have, is a $20 million company is not the same place as a $10 million company. Sure. You can hang on to your values, but the culture is invariably going to have some wobble in it.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And then you throw on something like the pandemic and remote workers and all this kind of stuff. Now you're in a digital environment. So the question is, how do we shift the vision and how do we align with that vision, right? As
Right.
opposed to how do we keep what we had? You don't keep what you had.
Right.
Evolution is a process, not an event. So you got to go through this process with as much ease and grace as possible. But that company did really well because their idea, and it was a first-time CEO. She was very young, 36 at the time, and it was, we want to change the industry, or we want to be out and sell this thing for 100 million in the next 3 years and be done, right? But working with them with very specific, what I'll call pivot points in the organization. Okay. Because there's kind of two org charts in an organization. There's the one with the titles and who reports to who, and then there's the influencers, right? There are certain people, and they're not necessarily the same.
Yeah.
And so as I sort of took an audit of this organization, I'm like, where can I have the most influence in this place? Okay, I see I need this person, I need this person, I need this because this connects to that. And here's the COO, and this is because operations and just putting the whole map together. And by working with those points of influx, those pivot points, we were able to get things moving a lot more smoothly so that there was a lot less friction through a steep growth curve.
But it sounds like, I love what you said there about the idea of two org charts and getting the buy-in from those who maybe not based on title, but based on sort of their interaction, their camaraderie, their influence, obviously within the company, getting them on board with this idea of flow and the vision and the values. You're able to have a much greater impact in the kind of work that you're doing with your clients.
Absolutely. And recognizing that what you're offering as an organization is of such a benefit to your staff, because it's not just going to be beneficial to the organization. It's going to benefit them as individuals, as humans, right? And so this is such a huge benefit to them and their personal lives, which you get to provide for them.
Maybe we can pivot the conversation there, because Chris, I love that. And how do you take some of this concept that you talk about in flow and apply it to whether it's the owner, the staff, the employees in their personal lives?
Well, flow is what we call an autotelic experience, which is just a fancy science word for addictive, because in the science community, they don't like that word.
Gee, I wonder why.
Right? It's like, it's addictive, but it is, like people, like the extreme athletes, for example, like the X Games or whatever, they say, oh, they're adrenaline junkies. They're not adrenaline junkies. They're flow junkies. It's a completely different thing.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, you've experienced this, Joe, and so has anybody listening, at least a low-level flow state. Think back to maybe not too long ago when you were working on something at work, or maybe, even in college, you were working on a midterm and you got so focused on what you were doing that everything else sort of disappeared. There was no distraction. There was no sense of even the self. There was just the thing you were working on. And it felt like 30 minutes went by, but when you looked up, it was like 3 hours and you had this incredible work product in front of you.
Yeah.
That's a low level flow state. And it feels so good. Like, how do I do that again? Right.
Right.
And this is how, and again, emotional regulation and de-stress and better performance. And it's like these people just start operating better, and it's all thanks to you and your organization.
Yeah. No, I love what you're doing, because I think people are looking for greater meaning at work. They don't want to just be taskmasters. They want to feel like they're making meaningful contributions, but doing it in a way that they enjoy, right? And so you're really bringing that to the surface and teaching them, I think, a disciplined way around how to access on a regular basis, not just on sort of one of these one-offs, which ultimately, if you can infuse the culture with that, creates tremendous enterprise value, right, for an owner if they're ultimately looking to have some sort of transition event. And that sort of brings us full circle here, right? We call this the Ripcord Moment, which I'm a firm believer. I've been working with a lot of business owners over the last several years, aligning their business plan with their personal financial plan. And, all too often we have found owners, right, just having created a master plan that helps to really close that wealth gap between what they need to live their optimal life financially outside of the business and what the transferable enterprise value of the business truly is. And so I'm a firm believer that when they go to transition that business, they have to have their ripcord ready, their parachute can't fail. And so, Chris, what would you say to the audience are 2 action items that an owner should contemplate sooner than later around this idea of flow?
Well, I think the first thing they need to be very clear on is what then? Once the sale happens, what then? Like, what will you be doing? What, because there's a lot that happens, especially during the sales. You're probably going to work long hours. You're going to have a lot of focus on this. It's going to take a lot of your time and energy. When this is done, there's going to be a big hole left behind, right? So, and the danger of that, especially if you've gotten into a flow state, there actually is a dark side of flow. But the danger to that.
Well, let's pause it. Let's go into that. What is that dark side?
Okay, so if in the case of an athlete, remember when I said flow involves risk?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm a mountain bike guy, right? So let's say, and I'm a pretty good mountain biker. I can jump a 24 foot gap. That's pretty far. So the problem is that,
very far,
right? That's a good jump, right? 3 feet up and 20 feet long. That's a good jump. So yeah, I haven't figured out that I'm not 15 anymore. But what do you think happens? Now, remember, risk is a flow trigger. What do you think happens after I've made that jump 20 times, 30 times, 40 times?
You get complacent?
Maybe it's not risk, right? The risk is gone. It just
right. The risk is gone. Sure.
Right. So what do I need to? Right. So what do I need to do?
Jump bigger.
Stretch it to 25 feet, 20. Right. So in the case of extreme athletes, flow can get you killed because the guys that are really good at this, the snowboarders that are jumping 110 foot gaps or something, that's like your life is on the line, right? I mean, literally. So you're kind of chasing that high. The other thing about flow is that you need to learn how to train out of it, just as you need to learn how to train into it. Because what ends up happening is that if you ride a flow wave too long, you're going to burn out all of your feel-good neurochemistry, because flow is just a euphoric experience, and there's a lot of chemistry going on, right? So what happens on the back end of a flow state is you feel really bummed out.
It sounds like you're coming off of almost like a hangover, right?
It's like
like you're crashing.
I love how astute you are. I actually call it the flow hangover here.
Right. Okay.
So you have to understand that, and this is the hardest thing to do, especially because we work with a lot of high performers. High performers don't want to stop. They want to keep going.
Just keep going, right?
But you've got to train. You've got to recover.
Yeah.
Right? If you're not training in recovery, if you're not giving yourself a break, look, your hobbies, your recreational activities, your weekends, your barbecues. If you are emailing me from the beach in Kauai, you might as well be in the office. You are where your head is. So you've got to have strong boundaries, because just like the body needs to recover from a workout, so does your brain, so that you can be more creative and get things done, right? So you got to learn how to train yourself out of flow as well as train yourself into it.
So it sounds like you were saying is for them to take the time to, as they're going through an exit, really think about after the transaction, taking the time to really get that identity clear. And I've heard this numerous times. And I think this is one of the biggest things owners don't do, unfortunately.
Right.
But then also you're saying is really take the time to set boundaries, probably to the extent you can, while you're building the business. And obviously, it's tough while you're going through a transaction because everyone's going up a gazillion miles an hour to get the deal done, due diligence, all of that. But to the extent that they understand this is not a sustainable long-term state, they have to have downtime to allow their body to recover, their mind to recover, their spirit to recover, so that they can then eventually get back into that state. It ebbs and flows.
Right. So that's the first thing, is you got to know what's next. And then you got to keep, the other mistake, you got to keep innovating. Like, you have to innovate through your exit the same way you were innovating when you got the company started, right?
Yeah.
Because again, the world you're selling doesn't exist. You're selling into doesn't exist yet, and so it can be really helpful to set the intention to keep the doors open as you're doing things, as you're heading towards this exit.
Right.
Notice what's going on. Like, oh yeah, we've got this widget that we're selling, but again, what else could it do, or what can we spin off of that? Think of like a TV show. What's the spin-off when this show ends? What's the spin-off?
What's the next story?
What's the next storyline? Because even if nothing comes of it, what you're doing is physiologically changing the brain works. You're changing your neurochemistry. You're coming up with creative ideas, right? Even if you stretch out into the fantastic, ridiculous, and the absurd, something you would never do, you're changing your brain. And what happens is viable elements and viable ideas start to slip into the fantasy.
Yeah.
And so that's how you keep yourself fresh. That's how you keep the ideas flowing, right? And it's just more fun that way. And feelings drive actions, right? If you're enjoying what you do, you're going to do it better. Basic neuroscience.
It's so true, Chris. Feelings drive action. So, well, Chris, I love our conversation. This has been fantastic. If somebody in the audience wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, you can get us on our website, statusflow.net. It is .net because the guy that owns .com wants to sell it for $5,000, and I'm just not paying that for a word. So statusflow.net. You can get us on Instagram at the Status Flow. You can email me, chris@statusflow.net.
Perfect, Chris. Well, thanks again for taking the time to be with us to share your pearls of wisdom about flow and how to hit a 20-foot mountain bike jump.
I'll take any time you want to go.
That's hey, we'll set that up. So we'll go ahead and sign off. This is Joe C2 from the Ripcord Moment, and we'll see you next time.